Today, I'm gonna show you how we set my cousin on fire by using After Effects and stock footage elements from ActionVFX. It's not gonna be a step-by-step tutorial because I found that to be very limiting, especially when it comes to complex visual effects shots. But with this one, I wanted to go full hardcore mode and not limit myself just so the tutorial wouldn't turn out to be 5 hours long. But with that said, I will try to break down the steps in as much detail as possible. First, for shooting, we set up this janky green screen in our studio, which we evenly lit with an Amaran P60C, and then used an Aperture 120D Mark II as a key light, together with another couple of Amaran P60Cs with the fire effect to get this flickering light on my cousin, which then acted out a few takes. And then once I brought them in After Effects, I trimmed out the clips that I needed. So here's the original one with the shirt on. And then I had another clip with the shirt off because I knew I wanted to add an effect where the t-shirt would burn away and then reveal the skin underneath. And then for separating the subject from the background, I couldn't just key it out because, as you can see, the green screen wasn't big enough. So at first I was trying to use the Rotobrush tool, but that wasn't giving me good enough results. So then I came to DaVinci Resolve and used the Magic Mask tool to cut out the subject, then brought that back inside of After Effects and did some extra cleanup work with the key light to clean up the green screen around his hair, and then a matte choker on top to clean up the edges as well. And then one last time I rendered it out as ProRes 4444 with alpha, and that's the clip you see here. For the background, it's just an image I got from Google, which I used the camera lens blur and the tint effect on just to take it out of focus and then desaturate it a little bit. There's also this environment lighting layer above it. This is just an adjustment layer with a curves effect to brighten it up and then give it tint effect by raising the reds and then lowering the blues. If I hit T to reveal the opacity, you'll see that I added a wiggle expression, but if I ram preview, you can see it gives this sort of flickering of light as if it's coming from the fire. And then it was time to start adding stock footage elements. These are all stock footage elements from ActionVFX, which is this video's sponsor. ActionVFX provides some of the most premium visual effects stock footage elements for use in movies and video games with a constant growing library of almost 10,000 assets, including collections such as fire, water, smoke, explosions, blood, electricity, and the list goes on and on. They also have a free-for-all section alongside the free for AVFX Plus users, which is their annually built subscription system that gives you immediate access to their assets based on the plan you choose, as well as discounts. I love that they offer this as it saves us the trouble of having to pay hundreds of dollars for an entire pack when we might only need a few elements from a specific pack depending on the project, and best of all, we get to keep those forever. This stuff has been used in a bunch of movies that you can see listed on their website, and I can definitely say they're top tier quality because I've used them in my own project. So if you're interested, then head on over to ActionVFX by using the affiliate link in the description. Now back in After Effects, these are the clips that I used. I can toggle the source name so you can see exactly which ones they were. And if I say double click on this one, it will reveal the source layer. But if I go back to the composition, you'll see it has a puppet pin effect. It's been twisted to match the contours of our subject. Now you can see that it doesn't quite line up with the original clip. And that's because I went ahead and froze the clip on first frame. So now you can see the subject doesn't move, it's just the clip staying on top. And the idea was that I wanted to freeze him, then match all of these layers to his body by again using the puppet pin tool. And that's this tool up here. So if I left click and hold, it's the advanced pin tool, which allows you to not only move things, but scale them up and down and also rotate them. And then I believe there's also one of the layers here that I use the mesh warp effect on. If I hit Ctrl-Shift-H, that will toggle the UI visibility. I distorted it so it matches a bit better with the body there. And then on most of them, there's also a solid composite effect, just to composite a black background. And that's because sometimes the puppet pin effect tends to yield weird results if it has a transparent background. So I just use a solid composite and then use the various blending modes to get rid of that black background. For some of these layers, you might notice that I also use some masks, specifically for the head. If I turn the mask off, you can see it was covering the face quite a lot. So I wanted those facial features to be a bit more visible. So that's why I put a mask there. If I solo back on the arm left, for example, toggle the mask, I can double click on it and then move it to the side. You can see it was going over his face. So that's why I put a mask there. So there's the arm right. Again, this was just to control where the fire was spreading. And then the one I'm happy about the most is this top trail. Let me shut off everything else and then double click on it to open up the original source layer. You can see it's just a trail of fire on the ground. And then I used a bunch of puppet pins to trace the top side of his body. And the idea was to add a bunch of fire elements to match with his body in a frozen state so it doesn't move. And then I went ahead and pre-rendered all of these elements. If I go over to pre-comps, here I have all of the same elements. But if I right click and go over to composition settings, you'll see it's about 6,000 pixels in width. So the elements wouldn't cut off. And then I pre-rendered just this and brought it back inside of here. That's this layer. And then what I did was to use the Mocha Pro PowerMesh tool. If I go back to the original clip, if I click on that to launch the Mocha UI, and then I'll shut this off just so we can create it from scratch. So I can trace around his body like so. Then make sure to turn on mesh tracking. Then switch the mode to uniform and then crank this quite high. I don't need as many tracking points. So let's say about 170, 180. We can hit generate mesh. And I'm looking to get some points throughout the middle of his body and then some to the side here. In fact, you could even go ahead and enter edit track mesh mode and then move points around where I want to add puppet pins to. And this will make sense in a moment. So let's say about there, something there, and then some on the head here. And then we can hit track forward. That will start doing its thing, but let's just cancel it with escape key. We'll delete that layer, turn the original one back on, and let's hit save. Then under the PowerMesh menu, I could hit the Create Nulls button, choose that layer, hit OK, and that generates a null for each of those mesh points. And then I can go ahead and lock this bottom layer so I don't accidentally select it, and then go ahead and delete all of these nulls. I only need a few of them that make sense. And I'll skip this part. So let's go ahead and delete them. We'll uncheck the Shy button so I can reveal the original nulls. And these are the ones I ended up with. And if I scrub through in time, you'll see they're sticking quite well to the body. And then what I went ahead and did was to add a puppet pin effect to the stock footage pre-render, which I can duplicate real quick. Let me go ahead and hit Ctrl-Shift-E to delete all of its effects and right-click Transform Reset. So if I select the Advanced Puppet Pin tool, we want to add these points close to the null object. So let's say one here, and then one here. By default, the puppet pin does add keyframes, so we'll click and drag down to disable those. And then we can search for position and select the first three nulls. Also search for position by selecting them and hitting return on the search bar. And then what we can do is alt click on the position of the puppet pin 1, parent it to the position of the first null. Puppet pin 2, null 2. Puppet pin 3, null 3. And now it gets messed up for a little bit. That's because of relative position space. It doesn't have the same layer size. So we just have to push this back in place. And you can select the puppet pin effect to reveal those points in the UI. And then just drag this back into place just so they roughly line back up with those nulls. Something like that. And then you'll see that these nulls are affecting the puppet pins themselves and in turn deforming the stock footage layer. So now let me go ahead and Ctrl-Z to undo all of that. We'll delete this one, bring back on the original one. And then once I turned off the freeze layer, you'll see that now everything is moving along because the fire is deforming with the footage because I tracked it. And then of course I have some real smart motion blur, which is this third-party paid tool to add fake motion blur, saturation, and the deep glow effect, which is my favorite when it comes to adding glow effects. It is also a paid tool, but it renders super fast and gives you great results compared to the built-in glow effect of After Effects, which takes ages not only to tweak so it looks right, but also to render. Then I used a bunch of these embers to composite on top. There's also some behind of the subject. These are a bit more dense in volume, so that's why I put them behind so it wouldn't be too distracting. Whereas for the ones on top, I can go ahead and solo all of these layers and then I'll disable all of these other ones. You'll see that I added an adjustment layer on top with the Real Smart Motion Blur to introduce some fake motion blur because these embers were shot at a high frame rate as well as with high shutter speed, so they're crisp and sharp, and then used various blending modes. And by the way, you'll see that almost all of these have either the screen or add blending mode enabled. And then again, I pre-rendered them just to save myself some time. And that's this layer, to which I added some saturation and another deep glow effect. But I felt it was still a bit empty when it comes to spark elements. So what I did was to use Trapcode Particular, and that's this layer right here, and use the layer emitter type and set it to use the keyed out element. So those particles would generate based on the transparency of this layer. Now do keep in mind that when you're using the layer emitter type, the layer that you use actually needs to be 3D, otherwise the particles won't show up. And if I go inside of the designer, I can first set the particles per second to about 500 just so I can show you what's going on. It has some velocity, a cloudlet particle type with 2 seconds of life. And then I set them to be full in size and opacity as soon as they're born. But then at the end, they scale down and also fade out. This is the color over life. So as they pop in, they have this hot, bright color. And then they fade into yellow. As they're dying, they go into this orangish, darkish, reddish color. And then I also added some noise or turbulence under physics and also under the displace with the fields. So if I set displace XYZ to 0, you'll see they're being pulled up by the gravity, which is -1000. But with some displacement, they go right and left because that's how sparks behave normally. And once that was done, I turned on motion blur and pre-rendered this because Trapcode Particular tends to render quite slow, and that's this layer on top. I did, however, render another version of this with quite a lot more particles per second, because again, I wanted this to be as dense as possible. And if I shut it off, that's this layer, body sparks, small, dense. But again, it's behind the character because I didn't want them to be too distracting. And you can see that I also use the CC vector blur effect to choke them out a bit, as well as deep glow for everything. There's also this other element that I added with Trapcode Particular of bigger sparks, so to say. And if I turn that on, that's the pre-render. This is the original. I'm still using the layer emitter type, but it's a different layer. That's number 47. I can turn off all the effects and go through them one by one. First, I'm blurring it. Then I'm using the set matte effect to take the matte from itself. So it cuts a hole and leaves this outline. Then I'm using the simple choker to thicken that outline and again blur it out with another blur effect. I then also used a mask on his head to make it so the particles wouldn't generate around his hair, and that's what I used to drive these particles. If I go inside of the designer, under the particle type, you'll see that I'm using a sprite that comes with particular, but you can even import your own if you wanted to by hitting add new sprite. Again, there's a bunch of turbulence. And then on the pre-render itself, I added some additional turbulent displace with an expression on the evolution to make it wobble around. It says time times 500, which means it's gonna evolve by 500 every second. And then I blurred them out as well as added a vector blur to choke them and give it this fiery look. And this is what it looks like when we combine all of those spark layers together, as well as the fire elements. But even then, if I zoom in some areas, say at this frame around the finger here, you could see that it was just some fire elements being laid on top, because this finger doesn't really have any fire coming out of it. To fix that detail, I added this other element called outline fire. And you'll see that it's made up of a bunch of effects. First of all, I'm using the Minimax effect to expand the alpha channel. Then I'm blurring it out. And again, I'm using the set matte on itself to cut out a hole and leave us with this outline. I'm blurring it some more, using the Minimax effect again to thicken the outline. I brighten up those values with a curves effect, got rid of the colors with a tint effect, composited some noise on top with a fractal noise, blurred it out a bit, then added a turbulent displace with a small size, as well as a turbulent displace with a bigger size. Both of those evolutions are also animated with a time times expression. Vector blur to choke it out, make it a bit more fiery looking. And finally colorized it with Video Copilot's Color Vibrance, free plugin by the way. This just gives you a lot of control over your colorization. Then I'm blending it over the original clip with an add blending mode, as well as adding glow. And this layer fills in that outer edge that was missing some sort of fire element. Then for the eyes glowing, again, I used the original clip and I just masked the eyes off by using Mocha. And I'll tell you this, whenever I can get away with not having to do manual rotoscoping, you bet I'm taking that chance. So I just went into trace around his eyes, tracked them. Here you have this option to create After Effects masks. And if you click that, it just generates those masks for you. And I can set these back to add. I tinted them to get rid of the colors, then colorize it back with color vibrance, and also added deep glow, as well as set this to add. So they composite on top like that. But then what I did was to also add these two other layers, one for each eye. It's the same eye masks, but an additional thing I'm doing is adding the CC radial fast blur effect. And this effect is actually why I had to split these two eyes into individual layers, because I wanted the CC radial fast blur to blur out from the center of each eye. And to do that, I created additional 2D nulls and generated the tracking data that I got by masking the eyes and applied that data to the corresponding nulls, then alt-clicked on the center and parented the center of the radial fast blur to the position of the corresponding 2D null. That way, the center of that fast blur follows the center of the eye. And same for the other eye. And those are then composited on top with the screen blending mode. So you can see without those two and then with those two. It just adds a bit more interest. Now on to the burning shirt. If I open up this torso shirtless and then open up this one, you'll see it's the original clip that I showed you all the way at the beginning of him just without a t-shirt standing there, but he was still kind of moving around. So I first had to stabilize him by using the Mocha Pro PowerMesh effect. And if you go under Module Renders, you can enable it and then switch over to Stabilize on Warp. So the body kind of morphs and then stays in place. And then back in this comp, I've used the clip with the shirt on, which is also stabilized so it doesn't move, as an alpha matte on the top layer to isolate our shirtless clip. But you can see that it was still not matching the silhouette. There's some empty pixels here. So I then used the liquefy effect to just push and pull some pixels of the body like that. And remember, this doesn't move. This is all stabilized to stick in place. And the reason I couldn't just take a freeze frame of it is because there was some flickering light on the body, which I needed to use instead of having a frozen frame. And then back on the main comp, if I turn off everything else, I used another instance of that same Mocha Pro stabilization, but this time instead of unwarp, I used warp, so it would actually deform back with the original clip. Oh, and a couple more things I forgot to mention is, first of all, if I turn on the original shirt version, you'll see that I've tweaked the position and scale of the shirtless clip just so it matches on top. So that's a very important thing to do, because if I duplicate this, delete the effect, take off the matte, and delete the mask, as well as right-click, transform, reset. And if we lower the opacity, you see they don't really match with the shirt clip. So I had to do some adjustments there. And also the other thing I had to do was to rotoscope it just around the area that I needed. So that's on those areas where we see the t-shirt. To create this burn matte, first I'm using the original shirt clip again. I've stabilized it so it doesn't move. And then here on this t-shirt matte solid, if I shut off the set matte effect, you'll see I've cut off this mask that roughly represents where the pixels of that t-shirt are. But I'm also using the set matte effect to cut it off, so it's sitting inside of the body silhouette. Then I created a new solid and generated some crispy burnt texture with a couple of fractal noise effects blended on top of each other, and then used the t-shirt matte to cut it off, as well as a mask on itself so it wouldn't reach all the way on top there, because if the t-shirt burns here, then it would just fall down. So that's the logic behind that. And also I added this extra solid on top, which is just a white solid with roughen edges and a fractal noise effect and some manually placed masks to art direct the burn, so to say, because here around this area is where you see the nipple underneath, because if I didn't have that, it was becoming a bit too hard to see what was going on because it was just burning away. The skin was too flat to notice any difference. So if I take a screenshot of this and then go back, turn back on the extra masks, you'll see the difference. So essentially, whatever is white is going to be visible and whatever is black is going to be invisible. So I'm using that to drive where the shirtless torso is going to be visible. And as you can see, if I hit U, I've animated the brightness on the fractal noise as well as the expansion on these masks to slowly reveal this burn texture, in turn giving us this reveal on the shirtless torso. But another thing you might notice, apart from the curves effect, which is brightening it up a bit, is that I've added a layer style inner glow with a dark brown color and a lot of feather with the size, just to give some shading around the t-shirt so it looks like the t-shirt is sitting on top and creating some shadows. Then there's these edge burns, so edge burn tight and then edge burn broad, which has a softer glow to it. And here I'll shut everything off. I'm kind of using the same technique that I did with the outline fire on the body, where I'm driving the visibility with the burn matte. Then I'm blurring it out a bit again, simple choker to expand the alpha channel, another set matte of the burn. So now we are left with this outline and then a bunch of blurs and hue saturation and deep glow. And this one is the same one, except there's a bit more blur on it. And it's set to screen as opposed to the first one, which is set to add to give some variation. And all of those combined give us this result. Now on to one of my favorite additions, the skin subsurface. So if I go inside of that, I have generated the texture with a couple of fractal noise effects and then added a bunch of contrast. Then I'm using the layer number 5 here as the matte. So that's what this looks like, which is also stabilized, by the way. And this set matte is what's driving the isolation on the skin. And that's this skin matte layer on top. So you can see that I've created manual masks to control where this texture should be visible. As you can see, if I move at the beginning, the t-shirt is all black because I don't want any subsurface texture to be visible there. But as we move forward in time, I have this other copy, which is the same as the fractal noise down here, but it's using the burn matte pre-comp that we're using back in the main comp, but we're doing it so we can reveal the subsurface on the skin as the t-shirt burns away. And then finally on top, I have this original clip, which I've added a tint effect as well as some curves to get rid of the color and also add some contrast, and then set the blending mode to overlay just to give it some shading, because without it, it just looks like I slapped some texture on top, but with it, it creates some definition. And if I go back and let's say take a screenshot here and then turn this off, you'll see the difference. And all of those combined gave me this look, but I wanted to pre-render it so I can move faster when it comes to the post-processing stage. And for that, again, I like to use the OpenEXR format. Under Output Module, you can choose OpenEXR. No compression, 32-bit float. That way we retain the highest quality possible, rendered it out, and then brought it back inside of this post-processing composition. First thing I'm doing is adding some heat distortion from Video Copilot. To drive the heat distortion, I'm using a layer mask, and that's this layer. I can go inside and you'll see that it's the pre-rendered layer from the stock footage elements. And what I did was to add some blur to soften it up. Then I composited self back on top, blurred those out, composited self back on top again, a little bit more blur, and then got rid of the colorization. The reason I'm doing this blurring and compositing stack is so that I can have this very smooth fall off on the displacement map, and that way on the post-processing effect, if I make this quite high just so you can see it, we get a bunch of micro variation on the displacement. And then I have another heat distortion on top, but this time I'm not using a layer mask, it's affecting the entire shot, but it's got a very subtle effect. And this is what I've noticed whenever I see heat distortion being used in visual effects shots, they usually overdo it, when in fact you want to keep it as subtle as possible, so when the viewer looks and focuses, they can notice it, but it's not in their face. Then I got a couple of lens flares with optical flares, which are blurred to death, and they also have a very low opacity. And you'll see here I have some flicker on. Also, I'm wiggling the center position. See, they're just jumping around just to introduce that lens flare flicker on the camera lens itself. And after I did that, I noticed that ActionVFX actually has a fire lens flares pack. Then for some color correction, I added this layer on top just to give it some more contrast and shifted the hue a little bit because it was looking a bit too yellow. Then there's some more glow on top with another deep glow effect, and then a grade with film convert to add some noise, as well as lumetri color. And then finally, some slight chromatic aberration with the quick chromatic aberration 3 plugin from Plugin Everything. This one is free actually. If I zoom in here and toggle this layer on and off, you'll be able to notice that effect. And again, subtlety is the name of the game. If I go back into full screen, you really won't be able to notice that chromatic aberration, but it gives some character to the shot as a whole. And then finally rendered that out, brought it back inside of this comp just to give it some camera movement. And by the way, I've used the preset pack that I made a video about recently to give this shot a natural handheld movement. You can check out that video by clicking the top card above. And that was pretty much it. Oh, looks juicy. So you can see now why I decided to do a breakdown type of tutorial instead of a creating from scratch step-by-step type of tutorial, because then it would have taken ages. I want to thank ActionVFX for providing us with their stock footage elements, and again, make sure to check them out by following the affiliate link in the description. Thank you for watching and being patient all the way through, and we'll see you next time. Peace out.